Hello, and welcome to our crash course for Introduction to Sociology, which is a course that will deal with various sociological issues having to do with individual behavior, the influence of various other factors in individual behavior, and the influence of individual behavior on society in general. In our first chapter, our first section of the course is going to be dealing with just general background concepts that are relevant to sociology. The sociological perspective is a concept that describes opening a window into unfamiliar worlds in a way by placing individual behavior in broader social contexts. If you look at the actions of one individual, and you may just look at it through that particular prism. Whereas if you look at the behavior of an individual, including that person's background, for example, if a person says a certain thing, that might not be palatable, or that might not be considered normal to us, but if you then remember that person that grew up in a different society, that person grew up in a different country, or that person had a different background, that person had a different life experience, you may be able to understand what that person says. So really this whole concept, this whole idea of sociology, is putting behavior in a societal context, trying to make sure that we understand what the context of individual behaviors are and how they operate. Socialization is the concept that society makes us human. In other words, the idea that people living all by themselves, obviously they're still human if you're a hermit and you're living alone on a desert island. If you're a castaway or something like that, you're still a human being, but that's not. But the idea of sociology is looking at not just the individual, but looking at the influence of the entire society on that person. That socialization is the idea that a person is influenced by his or her society, his or her socialization. There is basic sociology, which answers basic questions about social groups, without making changes necessarily in those groups, maybe studies a social group and looks at the impacts of the members of that group, or the impact of the societal rules and societal characteristics on the members of that group. And then you have applied sociology. Applied sociology is when you take these ideas and actually use it to change something, use it to change a society. Now, a society could be an entire country or the entire world, or a society could be a very small group of people. A society, for example, could be 3 or 4 people working in one branch of one office, could be considered a society for these purposes. Every time you have groups of people that interact with each other, you have some sort of a dynamic between them. You have an aspect of interconnectedness. And applied sociology is when we take the concepts that we're studying and we look at how these concepts, these sociology concepts, can be used to hopefully improve a particular environment. The scientific method is something that applies to all social and natural sciences. This is not necessarily specifically relevant to this course. If you've taken other courses, you may have seen this concept come up over and over and over again. Scientists use to study the world is the way scientists study the world is the scientific method. The scientific method, long story short, and it's a little bit of a longer story than this particular slide tells it, but you have a hypothesis which is developed. A hypothesis is an educated guess. A person who's looking to solve a problem takes a guess as to what might solve the problem. Hopefully that guess is not just a wild guess. Hopefully that guess is based on some level of experience or some level of insight or some level of logic. And then tests called experiments are done in a controlled environment to see if that hypothesis is correct. This requires replication, which means doing something numerous times, to establish whether something is true or false. If I hypothesize, for example, to take a sociological idea, that treating somebody nicely will cause that person to behave more nicely towards his or her coworkers, well, the way I might test that, theoretically, I might take 25 or 100 different situations, and in which you have people who don't treat people nicely, and in half of them I would treat the person nicely and half of them wouldn't, and then see what the effect of each of those 100 people are on the environment. Now, obviously, that sort of experiment might be difficult to run, but you have to. Experiments of this type can be run in the sociological environment if enough thought and enough funding and enough effort is put into it. If the hypothesis was correct, in other words, it is confirmed by experimentation that it has a significant impact, then it becomes a theory, or if it's not correct, it gets thrown out or modified, or something to that effect. Some general concepts of sociology include survival of the fittest. Now, survival of the fittest is something that, of course, is borrowed from biology. It's borrowed from the idea that organisms will continue to evolve and continue to adapt to conform to their environment. Well, the same thing is true when you're talking about a context of society. You know, as humans, we hopefully try to take care of the weak and try to take care of people who cannot fend for themselves for whatever reason and try to improve people's lot in lives even if they're having trouble. But without that intervention, and just from a natural perspective, the ones who are most able to fit into society for whatever reason, whether that be emotional strength or physical strength, intelligence, cunningness, street smarts, whatever the case may be, these are the people that are going to rise, generally speaking, to the top of a society. So this is the continued existence of those that are best adapted to their society, with the remaining lower part of the system unable to make it. This is the idea of social Darwinism as opposed to biological Darwinism, which was the original Darwinism, but the idea of social Darwinism, if you have a company, for example, so the theory is that the people who are most able to manage the company and the people who are most able to make it in the company will eventually rise to the top, and the others will either stay on the bottom or eventually lose their jobs. We don't have it to the same extent as biological Darwinism with animals, because we don't, kill people who don't make it in society. At least maybe in the old days they did. Today we don't do it, thankfully. But still, some of these concepts can be adapted to the idea of society and social aspects of society. Then you've got social change. Social change is where societies change certain aspects. A major societal change can happen based on an incident, or a major societal change can happen based on forces, general forces that come into effect. Karl Marx, for example, who was really the grandfather of communism, the idea of communism, not necessarily the application of communism, but he kind of thought of and wrote treatises based on the idea of communism, and he believed that the economics was central force for societal change and that people should try to change society. Marx's basic idea historically was that, certainly when Marx was around in the 1800s, the general world economic system was complete capitalism, where the person who owned the business ran the entire show, and all the workers were just really second-class citizens who completely relied on the person who owned the company. And Marx's idea was that eventually the workers would revolt, and the workers would basically throw the business owners out, and then they would take over the companies, and then the workers would run the companies. And if the workers run the companies, things would be more efficient because the workers would be more able to direct what happens to the company. They'd be more invested in the company. They'd make more money because they wouldn't have to worry about the profits of the bosses because there wouldn't be any bosses, etc., etc., etc. That was really the founding principle behind communism. It didn't work out so well, or at least it didn't work out well so far. I mean, obviously you never know what's going to happen in the future. The problem with Marx, and I'm getting a little bit off topic here, the basic problem that either Marx didn't anticipate or didn't think it was going to be such a big factor, is that when the workers take over the means of production, you don't have any profits, and the workers just take home everything, and nobody actually makes any profit, and all the worker gets paid the same amount, which is the underpinning of communism, is that it decreases the incentive of people to innovate. The workers don't really have an incentive to change things and make things better because they're not really going to see any reward for it anyway. They're just going to get paid the same as they always are. I mean, I think that was the fundamental problem with communism, but again, that's really a story for a different course. Max Weber believed that religion was the central force for social change, and that a sociologist should not allow values to affect research. That's the idea that what I think ought to be should not affect the idea of what I think actually happens based on study. That, of course, is a fundamental underpinning for a natural scientist. A natural scientist should certainly not go into experiments saying, well, I think that this food ought to be healthy, and therefore I'm going to try to make it healthy based on my experimentation. That obviously makes no sense. You have to look at the way things are. Although interesting is a little bit of a sidelight, a little bit of a counterweight, they say that Albert Einstein thought of many of his theories by just sitting back and thinking about the way things ought to behave, and he figured out the way particles actually behave by thinking first on how he thinks they ought to behave. Marx's, as I mentioned before, Marx's basic theory, or one of Marx's central ideas, was this idea of class conflict. And Marx believed that the key to human history was based on class struggles between the upper class and the middle class and the lower class, working class and the owning class, etc. And his idea was that in every society up to that point, there was a small group of people who controlled the means of production, in other words, controlled the companies, controlled the things that actually made the stuff, and they abused, really controlled, exploited the workers who don't own the means of production. And his theory, of course, his idea was that they should throw the bourgeois, the people, the capitalists who own the means of production, they should throw the bourgeois out and take over the means of production themselves. That's really what communism was about. Communism was about the workers controlling the government and the workers controlling everything. Again, when communism eventually did take over in countries like Russia and Cuba and China for a while there. China's still considered communist officially, but in real life they haven't really been communists, at least since the 1980s and Deng Xiaoping, and really since the death of Mao Zedong. But okay, that's another story. So the idea is that the capitalists control society's resources. The capitalists, the people who run the companies, have political power over the workers, and the proletariat, who are the workers who are exploited by the capitalists, are under the thumb of the capitalists, under the thumb of the bourgeois. And again, his general idea was that the proletariat would revolt, throw the bourgeois out, and take over the means of production. Then you'd have this socialist paradise where everybody would work, and everybody would be equal, and everybody would do everything just for the greater good of society. And again, in real life, when it actually happened, when communism actually did take over, it didn't work out that way. Of course, some people will tell you that real communism never took over, and Russia wasn't really real communism. It was really an oligarchy that was masked as a communist country. But again, that's really more history than it is sociology. Our next sociological concept is that of ethnocentrism. Ethnocentrism is believing in the superiority of your particular ethnic group. So ethnic, which is ethnicity or ethno, and then centrism means that you believe that your group is the center. Yours is the one that everything else swirls around. Now, in this example over here, where somebody goes to a trip to a different country, and then when you get back, say, oh, they're a bunch of backwards, who knows what's. That, again, first of all, it may be true in some cases, depending on where you go. But the idea that people think that their society is the best and their country is the best, or they're not even necessarily country, really their culture is the best. Somebody who believes the United States is the best is not necessarily ethnocentric. The person might be ethnocentric, but a person who believes that his or her culture is the best culture out there and everybody else's culture is inferior, they may be right in some cases, but that's the idea of ethnocentrism, and it's a fairly dangerous belief system based on the idea that if you believe that your culture, your group, whatever it is, has the number one lease on everything that's good, you might not learn from other cultures, number one, and it might cause xenophobia. It might cause people to be afraid or condescending or disrespectful of other people from other cultures because they believe that the other people belong to an inferior culture. Ethnocentrism can be a fairly dangerous and fairly poor attitude for people to have. Of course, some people do. Instead, the opposite way of looking at things is cultural relativism, which is the attempt to understand an unfamiliar culture, not through necessarily your eyes, but on its own terms. If you go to a place that's where people live in a tribal society without electricity and without hospitals and without computers or whatever it is, you might, if you're looking at it through your own perspective, you might think, boy, these people have have nothing interesting in their lives, and they're probably bored all day, and they've got no computers to play on, they've got no cell phones to communicate, and they've got no hospitals. They probably they get sick a lot, etc., etc. And but the idea of cultural relativism is to try to look at things through their eyes. Maybe this is a society that they like, that it gives them certain advantages over other societies, or maybe they have no choice, or maybe this is just the way it's always been in that society. Obviously, it's very difficult to really understand and study somebody else's society. First of all, because most people happen to be egocentric. Most people happen to think that they, or the people around them, or their way of doing things is the best way of doing things, or at least a very good way of doing things. And so to study someone else and give them a fair shot in your own mind that their way of doing things might be as good as my way of doing things is not something that people very often have an easy time doing. New cultures are seen as different and often viewed with bias. We look at cultures without electricity. We look at cultures that are based on a monarchy rather than a democracy. We look at cultures based on other that do things differently than we do, and we may look at them inherently as being backwards or being wrong or being being unfortunate, even if we don't necessarily blame them. And the other thing is that the new culture may have very different practices, tools, values even. We look at certain, we may look at freedom of speech and as being a very important value. Other people may look at freedom of speech as being just an impediment towards the good of society. We look at the right of, perhaps, of property as being something wonderful, that people have the right to their own property and the government can't take it away. Other people might look at property rights and say property rights are an impediment to equality. And so it's hard, very hard. And people can do it, obviously, but it's very hard for people to actually give other people, so to speak, kind of a fair shake in terms of analyzing their society. Psychology also has a role in sociology. Really, the next few slides are going to be based on the idea of psychology and how they apply. If you've taken psychology courses, you've probably learned a lot of the concepts that we're going to cover in the next few slides. But first aspect is the idea of emotions. An emotion is a natural inboard state of mind coming from one's circumstances, mood, or relationship with others. People feel happy, or they feel sad, or they feel angry. It obviously is based on other things that have happened. It's based on the person's mood. It's based on the person's relationships. It's based on the events that have happened to that person recently or over the course of a lifetime. But these are things that are kind of inherent in human behavior. People sometimes can try to overcome their emotion if their emotion leads them to do something that's destructive. So many sociologists believe that both the emotions and the mind depend on socialization, because the way we express our emotions, the way we feel, has to do with our gender, culture, social class, relationship settings, things that we don't think of it that way, but things that we get angry about may only be because we're trained to get angry about them. Things that we overcome, it's because we're trained to ignore, trained to overcome. Things that we feel sad about might just be because other people in our society feel sad about when certain things happen, and because of that, we react in accordingly. So emotion is not something that's just inherent. Emotion is something that does depend to a large degree on how other people in your society react to a certain circumstance. Then you've got the old nature versus nurture debate. Nature versus nurture is the question of, does a person's reaction to something, does a person's behavior depend more on the person's nature, the person's DNA, the person's predisposition, the way the person was kind of born to act in a certain way, or nurture, which is really based on how society and how the person's education and the person's parents and the person's schooling trained that person to react to specific circumstances. Now, as is discussed generally in psychology, there's no right or wrong answer. The answer is not, yeah, well, nature is the answer or nurture is the answer. I don't think anybody thinks that. I think it's the idea that it's definitely some sort of a combination between nature and nurture. A person's hereditary traits, a person's genes, a person's predispositions, their innate qualities, their person, what a person enjoys, certainly affects that person. But the nurture, the personal experience, the effect of the social environment, effect on a person's education, certainly what the person was trained to like or enjoy or be able to do well or think. A person may not like a job, but a person may think that job is his or her calling or his or her destiny in life. Now, the reason why people usually think that things are their destiny is because they were trained to think that that's their destiny, either trained intentionally by their parents in schooling or trained unintentionally by the actions and the things that they've gone through. Maybe if somebody goes through a war and sees all the devastation that can bring, maybe the person will then feel that his or her destiny is to try to cause peace or something to that effect. Nature versus nurture is obviously something that the answer is both, although of course different people will tell you different ratios. Some people will tell you nature's a little bit more than others would say, and other people might say nurture is more important, but the idea is there's certainly some sort of a combination, and it also varies from person to person. A person whose nurture included very strict disciplinarian schooling may have his or her education overcome nature more than some other people. A person lived in a place grew up in an area where there was no real authority, maybe nature applies more. A person grew up in a boarding school where they crack down on everything, maybe nurture applies or takes shape more. Next, we're going to look at certain stages of the human development and how they apply. And this next few slides is really more of a psychology aspect to sociology, but of course psychology and sociology are both social sciences, and they have a lot to do with each other. Acquiring basic human traits requires social interactions. Now, animals have traits. They are hungry, they're aggressive, they're scared. These are things that humans have also, but animals have, so they're not really considered human traits because, animals have them as well. Human traits, which are things that really are shown by humans and developed by humans and used by humans, maybe complex emotion, ability to study things, ability to draw conclusions, ability to objectively analyze things. These are things that have to be developed by society. Society makes people into humans, so to speak. If a human being grew up in the forest and there were no other people around, they may have some basic problem-solving skills, but they're not going to be able to do the kinds of things that we in a society need to do to interact with our fellow human beings. Where are these things developed? Well, they're developed at home, but they're also, of course, developed at school. School is the transfer of allegiance from family to peer groups. We don't think of it that way. We send our 4-year-old, 5-year-old to school. We don't think of it, okay, well, now we're transferring your allegiance from your family. I mean, you're still coming home at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. But the thing is that it's a little bit of a transfer. You're giving up a little bit of control over your child, your child's interaction. And your child is now going into the society that involves the teachers and the friends, which is an important way in which children learn to adapt to a society. Then we've got theories of development. First of all, we'll look at Mead's theory of development. Mead looks at the way children symbolize or copy, or by symbolic action, significant others, who could be parents, could be older siblings, could be teachers, could be friends. And Mead's idea was based on the idea that children grow to the point where, or by looking at and imitating other people's actions. The idea of role-playing. Child takes the role of the significant others. While the child is a baby under age 3, through imitation, by copying what the adult does, by copying what the parent does. Then you have through play, role play, and then through team games, which could be much more complex. We have Piaget's theory. Piaget's theory is a little bit more complex, a little bit more in depth, and that's the idea, just the idea of how a child and in what stages a child develops from the stage of being a baby, really not having any social interaction, or I shouldn't say not having any social interaction, but not having already developed socially, to the point of adulthood. You've got the sensory motor stage, which is all the way at the beginning of life. And I've got this diagram which I think shows it a little bit better. The sensory motor stage is where the child, the baby in this case, really just explores the world through senses. We've all got 5 senses, of course: taste, touch, hear, smell, and sight. And we use those senses to explore our environment. Even adults use those senses, but babies pretty much only use those senses. Babies like to put things in their mouth, and that's why it could be dangerous to give them something very small. And the reason is because they're using their sense of taste. Of course, they use their sense of touch by touching everything. They use sight and smell and hearing naturally, of course. And they also try to use taste because they're in that sensory motor stage where all they're doing is exploring their environment by using their their senses. Then you've got the pre-operational stage. This is where the child uses symbols to represent objects, but doesn't really reason logically. The child can form stable concepts, although the child doesn't really fully understand the world about him or her. The child may still have magical beliefs. The child is egocentric. The child doesn't necessarily look at the good of others. The child's not really capable of fully understanding the ramifications of actions for other people as well. I mean, good luck explaining to your 3-year-old that why it's not a good idea to wake up a parent at 3 o'clock in the morning. You can say, well, if your parent has to wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning, he's not going to be able to go to work the next day, and if he's not going to be able to go to work the next day, he's not going to be able to make money, and if he's not going to be able to make money, he's not going to be able to pay the mortgage, and you're not going to be able to live in your nice room and get your food for breakfast and everything. Good luck explaining that to a 3-year-old. It may make sense, but the 3-year-old can't possibly understand it. So, I mean, the only thing you can do if you don't want your 3-year-old to wake you up is probably lock the door and to your bedroom, and that way the 3-year-old can't get in. Or if you don't do that, I guess there are certain basic things that the child can understand. The child can understand that if he tries to wake you up, he's going to be put back in his crib, or something like that. That's one possible way. At least the child understands from a personal standpoint, from a very basic incentive standpoint, that that certain things have consequences. A child who's 3 or 4 years old is certainly capable of learning from being punished, and so a child's capable of understanding it in that, but only on a very, very basic level. Obviously, a 3 or 4-year-old is not capable of understanding all the depths and calculations that go into rules. Then you've got other stages. You've got the concrete operational stage, where you're talking about a child, really the older child stage. The child can think logically about concrete problems, can add, subtract, etc. The child understands conservation, saving things. A child may say, I'm not going to eat my candy now because I want to eat it later instead. 3 or 4-year-old is not usually going to say that. A 3 or 4-year-old thinks that if they don't eat their candy now, the candy disappears and never comes back. Saving things for later and doing things for their own long-term best interest is characteristic of an older child. And then you've got the formal operational stage, and the formal operational stage is when the child is capable of thinking of things in hypothetical terms, thinking of things not just how they look now, but capable of strategizing and planning and thinking of contingencies and figuring out, what to do if it goes wrong, things like that. That's really indicative of an adolescent and, of course, eventually an adult. And our final basic issue of psychology that we're going to cover before we move on to other things that are really, more closely related to sociology specifically, but is the psychoanalysis. Psychoanalysis is the idea of analyzing somebody's psyche, analyzing somebody's psychological issues for purposes of treating them, for many different types of purposes there can be for psychoanalysis. Psychoanalysis can be for treatment of emotional problems, long-term, extensive exploration of the unconscious mind. Really, it's a technique that's Freudian in nature. Some people disagree with the entire concept. Some people just disagree with just elements of what Freud came up with, although very few eminent scientists today, I believe, still believe completely in everything that Freud came up with. But Freud developed this idea that the mind has three different components: the id, the ego, and the superego. The id being kind of like the child, kind of the thing that just wants instant gratification. On the other hand, you got the superego kind of warning, the warning part that says, oh, this is not good for you, just be careful. And then you kind of got the ego, which is, I guess, in the middle, the combination of the two, which has to ultimately make the decisions. I mean, here are some examples over here. You got the id saying, I want it now. Then you've got the superego saying, you can't have it, it's not right. And the ego, the one in the middle, the rational one, the one that's going to actually make the decision, being the saying, well, I can get it, but I need to do a little bit of planning, kind of like a little bit of a compromise here. Here's one person who put it: the id as the devil and the superego as the angel. The superego says, do what's good for you, and the id says, no, I want it now, and the ego's got to figure out which one to do. Here's another idea that the id, I want it, satisfy me, I need it, and the superego is kind of like the parent that says, no, you can't have it. That's the boss, and the ego's got to be in the middle and figure out what actually to do. That's the idea of where people kind of have two inclinations. They could be a good inclination and a bad inclination, or it could just be an instant gratification inclination and a long-term strategy inclination. There's not necessarily does there have to be one as morally correct. Where do emotions come from? Well, emotions are based on instinct, really. They're based on nature. They're not necessarily based on just what we look at and just what we experience. According to Ekman, we've got 6 types of emotions: anger, disgust, fear, happiness, sadness, surprise. The rest of them, of course, are just kind of combinations, various combinations of those types of those elements, of those 6 basic emotions. These emotions are expressed similarly throughout the world. No matter where you go, people are going to have anger, people are going to have disgust, people are going to have fear, happiness, sadness, surprise. They may react to them differently, and they may, based on societal developments, they may have different triggers. In one society, people may be happy if their team wins a ball game. In another society, they may be happy if they get praised by an elder. Another society may be happy if they make $1 million. In other words, different societies have just different triggers of that emotion based on societal norms, but all societies have these emotions to one extent or another. Some general ideas, in other words, difference between the genders. Men are generally more subdued in expressing emotion. Women tend to express emotion more, although obviously that's just a general trend. It doesn't apply to everyone or even necessarily most of the people in a particular group. And of course, differences in social class affect the way in which emotion is expressed. People who are used to adverse situations might not be as outraged or disgusted by certain things that people in upper class who are used to being coddled might consider disgusting. Now we're going to shift gears a little bit and go to sociological analysis, looking at how people view their society. Macrosociology is about the large-scale features of social life, looking at our social structure, like a person letting someone else go ahead of him in the supermarket checkout line. That's not really in accordance with what we're naturally trained to look out for ourselves and to be self-centered. But when we hold the door open for someone, thereby being 10 seconds late, or when we let somebody go in front of us, we're reacting to what our society has taught us. We're reacting to the social structure that we've been taught by our friends or by our parents, by our schooling, whatever the case may be. That's the idea of macrosociology. Again, the idea that because society deems a particular behavior appropriate, that becomes worked into the way we behave. There's microsociology that focuses on social interaction on a one-on-one level. Then you have this idea when you're talking about looking at sociology, the difference between a functionalist and a conflict perspective. Not that either one is the correct answer, but they look at society in a different way. The functionalist perspective is the idea that society, for lack of a better term, is good. Society is a complex a system whose parts work together to promote solidarity and stability, whereas the conflict perspective looks at the opposite, draws attention to the differences inherent in society between the more powerful and the less powerful, between the rich and the poor, between the people who have different ideologies, people who have different belief systems, people who have different religions even. The idea that if you can look at society as being something that is necessary for good and helps people in their development and in their behavior and pretty much in everything, and you can look at the negatives of society. Again, neither is right or wrong necessarily. It's just the idea of they're both correct in some extent. Societies can cause divisions and wars and hate, and societies can cause people to be helpful to one another and increase the development and enjoyment of life for everybody. Part of the conflict perspective is this idea of social class. Social class, it means a large number of people who share specific characteristics and social location. This could be based on income, it could be based on education, it could be based on prestige, it could be based on pretty much anything. Now, social class, the idea is in the old days there was very little social mobility. If you were born in feudal Europe in the 1300s and they're in the 1200s, whatever it is, if you were born as a knight, you were going to be, well, if you were born as a lord, you were going to be a lord. You were born as a knight, pretty much you were going to be a knight. You were born as a serf, you were going to be a serf. You were born as a peasant, you were going to be a peasant. Whatever you lived in, you could move from class to class, by gaining the favor of the king somehow, or by committing a crime and being punished and going down. There are various ways to move between classes, but it was very difficult, or it was very unusual. In today's day and age, there is a lot more social mobility. People who are poor can become rich by inventing a good .com business or something and can become super rich. People who are rich can become poor by making a few bad investments. People who are in a lower class can become educated and join a higher class. So there is social mobility, but there still are social classes. You hear it from time to time. Middle class, upper middle class, lower middle class, working class, poor, the rich, the 1%ers. You hear a lot about this idea of the distinctions between different classes of people, and of course that could be a negative thing, because people could come to resent people in different or higher classes or lower classes even. The rich people might think that the poor are trying to take their money, and the poor people might think that the rich have taken their money. So that obviously could be a problem, but you also have this idea where people in classes might work together, and the working class might form labor unions to negotiate themselves better benefits and better salaries and better positions. Social standing is also based on location. Location is based on where you are in the social strata, where you are in the social structure. Your age, your gender, your education level, your job, your income, these are all things that are relevant. If I say that I am a 40-year-old white male with a graduate degree who works as an educator and has an income of, well, okay, I'm not going to continue that sentence, but that's one category. That's one category of people. This determines the social location of the people. That's people who have very different aspects of all these. Neither one of these is particularly dispositive. Just because somebody's 39 years old doesn't mean they're like me. Just because somebody's a male doesn't necessarily mean they're like me. And just because somebody is 70 years old doesn't mean they're not like me. But when you combine all these factors, you can get groups that behave in certain manners. Certainly, if you take all 39-year-old white people with graduate degrees and then, on the other hand, who are men, and then you take all 23-year-old women who have no high school diploma, they're going to behave. The people in each group are going to behave more similarly to each other than to the people in the other group. And this can be studied on a sociological level, of course. There's, of course, no ironclad rule. Just because you're part of a group doesn't necessarily mean you behave like that group. But you can look at it as a whole. Sometimes in elections they'll say, well, you know, African Americans vote Democratic. Well, that's not true 100% of the time. Certainly, there are many African Americans who vote Republican or don't vote, who vote Independent or whatever it is. But you can still say, as a general principle, 85%, 90%, whatever it is, of African American people are going to vote Democratic. And so, politicians and people who are studying society can make these generalizations and can look at, even though of course it's not going to apply to each individual, they can make generalizations and do things differently in order to change things. And point is, you can study a society based on these factors. You can study a group of people based on these factors. Of course, positions in society mean how people interact with the other people in their society through status symbols, which are signs that identify a position in society that somebody occupies. When we hear of a status symbol, we think of a nice car, which is indicative, or at least could be indicative, of where a person is in society. A person drives by in a brand new Lexus. Other people think, well, that person is rich. Doesn't necessarily mean that person is a good person. It doesn't mean that person contributes to society, but it usually does mean that person is rich. If a person buys a house in the suburbs, then then has a minivan and has a 4-bedroom house in the suburbs, then that's kind of a symbol of what that person's role is in society. A person who has a 4-bedroom house in the suburbs and a minivan is probably not a single person who likes the city life and goes to nightclubs every night. Rather, that person is probably the head of a family and has kids. That's usually what the reason is. That doesn't mean it's 100%, obviously. Just because if you like the city, just because you like the city and are single, there's no law against driving a minivan and going out to the suburbs and buying a 4-bedroom house. But it's just not usual, and so it's kind of a symbol. Just like if you drive a beat-up old car, you could be rich and just like driving beat-up old cars, but these are still status symbols that generally indicate a person's role in society. I'm sorry, status and a role are two different things. A status is a social position, whereas a role is what you actually do. A social expectation, a particular job that you do, a particular thing that other people come to expect of you. Now, there are different types of societies, including where we live, and differentiating between those societies. Classification societies was established by Durkheim. Durkheim, I think, was a French sociologist in the late 1800s, late 19th century, and he classified different types of societies. There's hunter and gatherer societies. I don't think we really have hunter and gatherer societies anymore, but ancient human beings who ran around from cave to cave and hunted bears and ate them and then stayed in the cave during the winter would be the hunter-gatherer societies. Pastoral and horticultural societies, people who relied mostly on agriculture. Horticultural meaning having to do with growing things, pastoral, taking care of animals, whatever it is, agricultural, industrial, post-industrial, which is our information societies, and the biotechnological societies, the biotech societies, which we also have today. Post-industrial societies, the information age, so to speak, are associated with change, information, and services. Change being that things are always changing. Different alliances are constantly happening between countries from a political level. Things are different. The technology is changing so fast that the way in which we interact with each other are changing. Between the idea of originally having to call somebody up on the phone if you want to listen to communicate with the person, to email, and now to things where everybody's got a handheld device that can do anything, and everybody's got their Facebook and WhatsApp and all these things where people can Twitter, people can interact with each other much more quickly. And this idea of information where people can access information at the tips of their fingers pretty much whenever they like. And the idea of services where people can get pretty much whatever services they like at a moment's notice at relatively low cost. Biotech societies are considered the new emerging societies, even not necessarily contradictory with a post-industrial society. Certainly aspects of both could apply. And biotech societies are based on the idea of major changes in which way we apply and alter genetic structures to produce food, medicine, and materials. These are the idea that we already use certainly a lot of biotechnology to increase agricultural yield, and you even hear some cases where people are cloning animals. Who knows what'll happen in the future? Maybe in the future humans will be cloned, and people will grow whole armies of people in order to fight in wars like they did on Star Wars. But okay, I don't know if that's going to happen necessarily. But the point is that the idea that people can almost control nature to some extent is a feature of the biotech society. And as society is transformed, we are transformed along with it. No way you can really just sit back in the old society and do things the old ways. If you want to be a hunter-gatherer, well, too bad. You can't be a hunter-gatherer because there are rules against going into the street and shooting animals and taking them back to your cave and eating them. And we need a society. We need a society of people to do it in order for that behavior to be manageable and acceptable. Even if you want to live in an era where there's no technology, I guess theoretically it's possible. I mean, you can go camp out in like some national park where nobody's going to find you, and I suppose you can do it, but it's certainly not as easy as it was for the people who actually lived in those societies. Next, we're going to turn to a breakdown of different facets of society. And there's this concept of McDonaldization, of course, after the McDonald's restaurant chain. And that's the idea. The McDonaldization is our products and things that we deal with turning into really an assembly line. One-stop shopping, robot-like food assembly, familiar franchise, packaged vacation tours. These are obviously not all relevant specifically to McDonald's, but the idea that everything is now a cookie cutter, everything is now pre-made, and rather than making your own food and going to the supermarket and buying some ground meat and then buying some vegetables and buying some side dishes and then going home and spending an hour in your kitchen making it and then eating it for supper. Instead, you can go to a fast food restaurant and order it, and the whole thing takes 3 seconds and is relatively cheap, and then you go home and eat your food, and that's that. And packaged vacation tours is that idea where rather than doing your own research and going to a place and spending hours looking over maps and guidebooks, determining where you want to go, and then going around in the place you're going on vacation to and determining where you want to go. Instead, you can just go on one of these vacation tours, and you just pay in advance and leave your wallet at home, and they take you there, and they put you on the ship, and they put you on the plane, and then they put you on the bus, and you go around, and you see everything, and they tell you exactly what to do. Kind of like these toys that just play with themselves. In the old days, you take the doll or you take the action figure and you have it do things. Now you can just take the toy and push the button, and the toy does what the toy plays with itself. That's the idea of McDonaldization. Lifestyle is extremely dependable, predictable, and efficient. It's relatively cheap when you buy everything at once, when you buy a packaged tour, when you buy a packaged burger rather than making your own. It can even be cheaper. People sometimes, I have relatives who like to make their own sushi. By the time you finish with buying all the ingredients, it probably costs more to make your own sushi than it does to go to one of these stores and just buy some sushi. It's the idea that if you just buy the same thing as everybody else, it can be done when it's manufactured in an assembly line style. It can be made relatively cheaply. Now, of course, the negative aspects is that there's less spontaneous action, less creativity, too much sameness, trapped in the quote-unquote iron cage. the, this term, McDonaldization, was coined by George Ritzer, although that doesn't really matter. But the idea that you're really putting yourself in a situation where you're just kind of following everything that other people do and not necessarily being creative at all. Within society, of course, we've got various groups. You've got primary groups, are the people that you associate with, your friends and family, long-term relationships, face-to-face association of people. And then you've got the secondary groups that you deal with, people who are not your close friends, people who are not your family necessarily, but these are people who interact with each other, maybe coworkers, maybe clients, maybe just people that you deal with on say your group, whatever your particular group. Now this slide only says two two groups, but the group that you think of the group that you're in. You might have a very small group that comprises of your immediate family. That's maybe your closest group. Then if you expand it a little bit, maybe it's your less than immediate family, maybe it's your good friends, and that's still the group of people that you interact with on a regular basis. If you make it a little broader and you include all your acquaintances and your clients and your coworkers, that's obviously a much bigger group, but it's not as it's not as close to you. And then if you go even further, maybe it could be all the people of your city, or all the people of your religion, or all the people of your race. Could be a group. And then beyond that, maybe the group is just the entire society. So grouping could be important to make a determination of what people's behavior and what people will be expected to do. The in-groups and out-groups are interesting, and it's interesting to look at, the differences in the behavior towards the people who are in your group and the people who are outside your group. People tend to be loyal to people within their group, much more loyal to people within the inner groups than the outer groups. You may be very loyal to your family. You might be somewhat loyal to your friends. You might be a little bit less loyal, but still loyal to your coworkers, and you might be a little loyal to people who are part of your same overall ethnicity. And the opposite of that is people may have antagonism or emphasize the bad traits of people who they see who are members of totally different groups. And people sometimes tend to apply a double standard. Double standard is the idea where you look at people in your own group and you see the good in them, and then you look at people in other groups and maybe you see the negative in them. In terms of grouping in general, you've got smaller groups and you've got bigger groups. Smaller groups tend to be more intimate, more dealing with people on an individual level. On the other hand, they're less stable, because the smaller the group, the more likely it is to be broken up by one or two people behaving in a way that's outside the group or leaving the group entirely. As the group decreases, in other words, as the group size decreases, there's a lower distribution of responsibility, which means each person has to accept more responsibility. There's a decrease in formality. If you're in your company with 150 people, you might have formal meetings to discuss everything. On the other hand, if it's your family, you might have a family meeting, but you're probably not going to worry so much about the formalities. When you have a meeting with your spouse and your 3-4 kids, you're probably not sitting there with somebody taking notes or video recording the discussion about where you're going to go on your family vacation. And of course, all members of the group can interact with one another. When you're talking about bigger groups, you're talking about whole companies or whole, associations or unions or whatever it is. Stability increases because there's more people there, that it's harder to disrupt a group by the actions of one individual, but intimacy decreases. There's a greater distribution of responsibility, maybe for an entire company with 150 people in it, maybe the people are given tasks that are more suited to their particular expertise, so that they can focus on them more. There's an increase in formality, and of course there are also divisions into smaller groups for particular aspects. That really leads us to some aspects of the workplace. The workplace which is really a group. Could be a small group in a small company, could be a big group in a big company, but the workplace is an important aspect of society, and it really is a society in and of itself. People who work in a particular industry, people who work in a particular job, a particular company, certainly are part of that society for many purposes. Diversity is increasing in the U.S. workplaces. Most U.S. workers in the old days were men and American born. And when I say the old days, I mean probably the early part of the 20th century and certainly in the 19th century. Today, more than half the workers are minorities, immigrants, or women, or all three, of course. Certainly, women make up a very large percentage of the workforce these days. I don't have the exact number. Although, according to a quick Google search that I just did, women now comprise, as of 2013, women comprised 47.4% of the civilian labor force, so almost 50%, essentially 50%. Leadership is part of a workforce. It's also part of society in general. Strong leadership can be good in some ways, and overly strong leadership can be bad in some ways. Leadership styles can be authoritarian, which is the idea that I am the one in authority and I tell you what to do, and I don't countenance any disapproval, I don't countenance any disobedience. There's democratic, which is through participation, which requires all people in the society to cover an aspect or to participate in the decision-making process. There's laissez-faire, which means hands-off. The authority is delegated to people lower in the chain, not necessarily worrying about the individuals. For example, just to give you an idea of the difference between authoritarian and democratic, of course, that could be in terms of government, but it could also apply in terms of running a company. A democratic leader might discuss policies and goals with its members, encourage members to come up with different ideas, offer assistance to people, but let them do their job, provide objective information to the people to help them work, whereas the authoritarian person in all these cases might just say, do it that way, whether you understand it or not. Then you've got leadership styles, which can be instrumental or expressive. Instrumental are more job-centered, They emphasize planning, problem solving. In other words, they focus on the job to be done. This is what needs to be done. This number of widgets have to be built in the next month, or this plan has to be executed. And expressive leaders, on the other hand, try to give attention to their workers, and they consult with others in their department or that are subordinate to them, rather than instrumental is kind of just get it done, however it has to be done. Expressive is more like try to work together with people to get it done in the way that overall it may not be as quick in the short term, but overall gets the most number of people involved and hopes to try to do it in a better way, even if it sacrifices a little bit in terms of efficiency. Authoritarianism, which, as we just discussed, is one of the ways of leadership. It's a form of government, and it's also a form of leadership within a company that means blind obedience to the authority, unquestioning obedience. Authoritarian leadership essentially says that you do what I say, otherwise there'll be obviously very bad consequences and things just won't work out. It has a tendency to encourage either aggressive or apathetic behavior among the group members. People can support the leader, in terms of, obviously we've seen some terrible criminals in history become authoritarian leaders. People like Hitler, Stalin, people like that become authoritarian leaders. People in their group can be very positively supportive of the government and do things unquestioningly and blindly without thinking about whether they're right or wrong. It can also encourage apathetic behavior where people just get totally turned off and just don't bother. That's one of the things. One of the problems in Nazi Germany was that either the people were very excited about the government, and people who liked the government were very excited about it and would do anything for it, including go to war and basically destroy the continent, or the other people, the people who were opposed to it, became apathetic and just became hopeless almost, because of the idea that this is the authoritarian leader and there's really nothing anybody can do to stop him. Aggressive members growing increasingly hostile toward their leader, of course, could also be caused by an authoritarian leadership style. Authoritarian could be positive or negative. Usually when you're talking about governments, it usually turns out to be negative, but when you're talking about individual circumstances, it could be positive. When a tour group is lost in the jungle, the tour guide should be an authoritarian leader. Come here, go there, do this, cut this vine down. Not just let's take a vote about which direction we want to head in. If the group leader knows based on the stars or based on whatever other factor there is, this is the correct way to go, then the leader's got to say we have to go that way now, and we're not going to have any debate about this. Of course, it could also be negative when the ruler of a country should not be an authoritarian leader and take away the rights of the citizens. Now we're going to segue to a new component of the course, and that is interaction between people. Obviously, interaction with people is a key part of sociology because the way in which society functions is by because people interact. People learn from each other. People take cues from each other. People develop strategies in terms of dealing with each other. There's verbal communications and there's nonverbal communication. Nonverbal communication is communication without words. They include hand gestures, facial expressions, even silence, not saying anything in response to somebody else's comment. Somebody else makes a suggestion, you just don't say anything. That's a way to communicate disapproval or at least lack of enthusiasm. The use of space, moving away from people or moving closer to people can certainly cause some sort of interaction. I once read a long study on this idea of how much space people like to have in between themselves and somebody they're talking to. Americans tend to like more space than other people because we tend to guard our personal space more zealously. People who are very close friends, I think, tend to be 24 inches apart when they talk. People who are somewhat friends, like 36 inches. People who are, who are strangers, tend to be 6 or 7 feet away from each other when they talk. I mean, there's all sorts of, things that we do subtly without even really thinking about it, without even really noticing it. But, we do use space to communicate like or dislike for the people that we're talking to. Then there's verbal interaction. And verbal interaction includes language, and language could be body language, which is nonverbal, or language could be, of course, be verbal. So language includes symbols put together in an infinite number of ways and communicates abstract thoughts, and of course language is part of a culture. Language doesn't necessarily only apply to the way people talk, but it also includes in terms of your facial expressions, your hand movements, your gestures. These are all things that are included in language, even if some of it is subtle, and even if some of it is not. It's not really something that we intend to use. Our facial expressions: we grimace, we frown, we smile, look surprised. You can look into a person's eyes and get a tremendous amount of subtle indication of the way that person's feeling, much more so than what the person's words might say. I read a book by Malcolm Gladwell called Blink, which is about thin slicing, about taking small bits of information and using it to make snap judgments. And the idea is that people, even though we do it subconsciously, we look at a person's expression and we make judgments about that person or about what that person's saying, even if it might be subconscious, that have tremendous ramifications. Posture is a person holding him or herself high and confident, or is a person kind of slouching and indicating lack of confidence. Gestures, of course, hand gestures, facial gestures, twitches, curling your nose at someone, raising eyebrows. These are all things that, of course, communicate ideas as much as spoken language. As for language, of course, we've got English, which is our official language in the United States, and of course Spanish being the secondary language in the United States, because certainly of non-English speakers in the United States, Spanish tends to dominate because of the large Hispanic population in the United States, and of course the fact that some of our territories are Spanish-speaking. Puerto Rico, of course, is a U.S. territory, and there are many countries in the Caribbean, including of course Mexico, right on our borders, where they speak Spanish. Of course, Canada is also on our border, but in Canada, for the most part, they speak English, and a little bit of French, of course. Gestures. Gestures are, of course, nonverbal cues, and there's an interesting debate about whether gestures are universal or basically instilled by our society. In other words, the idea that we smile and smiling indicates that we're happy. Is that something we're born with, or is that something that, well, because everybody else smiles when they're happy, so we learn to do the same thing? And I guess it's another one of those questions where there's not necessarily a right or wrong answer. I think everybody would agree that some gestures are universal. I mean, babies, when they're happy, tend to smile. It's not because they were taught to smile, although parents do very often encourage them to smile subtly or not so subtly. But one way to look at gestures, they are universal, is the idea that they're built into the universal makeup of the human being. Anger, pouting, fear, sadness, these are things that people are born to make. But then there's the idea. Again, it's not necessarily 100% one way or 100% the other way. It's a combination. That gestures also depend on where you are. Rude gestures in Mexico don't necessarily mean the same thing in American culture. We have a certain culture where that establishes that certain gestures with our hands or with our face may be considered rude or angry, whereas other cultures may not necessarily mean the same thing. Symbolic interactionism is the study of these gestures, or the study of these symbolic indications. A view of social behavior that emphasizes language and gestures as a means to communication. People might study gestures and make a determination of how people are actually think when they make these gestures. The FBI and these crime-fighting organizations very often have people who are expert at detecting lies. Now, of course, they can never be 100%. Even the lie detectors are not 100% effective, but they can. The way these people learn their craft is by recognizing facial gestures. Is by they look at somebody's face very carefully when they're talking, and very often that person can give away whether they're lying or telling the truth by their gestures. Are their eyes opening a little wider? Is their mouth curling a little bit? Again, I don't know the answer. I don't know how these things work, but I know that that's how people become expert at telling whether people are lying, by picking up on the very, very subtle cues that are in their facial expressions or gestures. There's other theories regarding symbolic interactionism. These are just theories that ascribe different ways in which people give away their thoughts by their facial expressions. And these are also theories of deviance, why people behave a little. We're going to discuss deviance in the next slide, but these are all theories about why people develop behavior that is different from other people. You've got this differential association theory, which is the idea that people come to associate with a particular group. For example, people become involved in a gang, or people become involved in friends that are not good for them, or they get involved with people who influence them badly. They turn to associate deviant behavior, not good behavior, with with whatever group they're in, and that's very often the reason why people behave in a bad manner. People who maybe grow up in a street in a ghetto, who, people who look to other people in their lives, and everybody else in their lives considers violating the law in some aspects to be a good thing. Well, then they may learn to do the same thing. Then you've got the control theory, which is simply based on the idea that people's behavior is determined by how much self-control they have. Can they control their impulses, or can they not? People who are deviant, people who are criminals, maybe just simply don't have the self-control. Then you've got the labeling theory, that behaviors are only considered deviant, that behaviors are only considered bad because society labels them as deviant. Because that the more of an idea that there's no inherent right and wrong, it's just that what we say is right and wrong. And again, these are just different ways of looking at deviance, so let's actually discuss deviance, which is next. Deviance is behaviors and actions that violate social norms. They include violating the law, violating the rules or unwritten rules. It could be of a family, it could be of a religion, it could be of whatever group that you're in. And the fact that something is deviant is only based on how people react to it. There's nothing inherently deviant about an activity other than the fact that other people consider it either wrong or different. And what we do as a society, very often we treat as as a medical disorder, as a psychological disorder, people who are deviant. The people with deviant behaviors are often medicated. Even children who just run around the classroom a lot are maybe given Ritalin or given something to try to control their deviance, so to speak, which makes it seem more like a mental disease rather than problematic behavior. And there are many different theories of deviance. We actually spoke spoke about that a little bit before, in terms of the three basic theories of deviance. But there's also some other ideas that causes deviant behavior. The XYY chromosome theory, well, again, that's historically people assumed that criminals, people who were very overly aggressive, had two Y chromosomes. Of course, you're talking about men here. Normally, a man has an X chromosome and a Y chromosome, whereas a woman has two X chromosomes. And getting an extra Y chromosome because of some sort of a genetic malfunction was thought to increase the person's aggressiveness. It's no longer accepted, so we don't really have to worry about that. There's the intelligence theory, the theory that people who don't have the intelligence to cope on a normal level turn to bad behavior. There's the body type theory, the people with muscular bodies tend to be criminals, I guess, because that leads them to believe that they can fight their way to anything. Then we have the idea of how they are dealt with, how deviance is dealt with. Deviance, generally speaking, is dealt with by sanctions. Sanction meaning negative consequences. Of course, you're talking about on a small level where you're talking about a family or a classroom, and where you're talking about on a larger level where you're talking about a criminal and how society deals with criminals. So there are negative sanctions, which are expressions of disapproval of deviance and, of course, punishment. And then you've got positive sanctions, which are a reward for good behavior. And of course, both of them are elements of treating or dealing with deviance. Both positive and negative sanctions can be formal. They could be written down and could be a way things are dealt with in general, or they could be informal that are dealt with on an individual basis. The more a society values a norm, the harsher the penalty for its violation. If somebody speeds in their car, they might get a fine. If somebody commits a murder, they may get life imprisonment. Obviously, there are different norms which apply, which cause different levels of sanctions to be applied, and of course that's just common sense. The purpose of positive sanctions is to encourage, of course, people to do things positive, and there could be formal punishments that are sanctions, or there could be informal. For example, publicizing negative sanctions could be done in a way where it's not necessarily so much the punishment itself that's sanctioning the behavior or sanctioning the lack of behavior, so to speak. It's also the reputation that's involved and the public shaming, so to speak, applying through the media, issuing fines, degradation ceremonies, shaming. And encouraging conformity, encouraging good behavior, can be done through public recognition, banquets, awards, announcements. This person is getting the whatever award. That, of course, tries to sanction good behavior. Shaming, which is a type of negative sanction, becoming more and more popular today in terms of social media, where people go on Twitter or they go on these things and say this person did a bad thing based on this, that, and the other thing. This is a way of publicizing nonconformity so that other people will learn to conform. If you don't like what somebody does and you go on Twitter and say this person did a bad thing, hopefully it'll encourage that person to, in your mind, to conform to the behavior in the future. Well, it says over here that shaming will only be effective in smaller settings like a family or close in society. I don't know if that's necessarily true anymore. Now that you have Twitter and people go on Twitter and try to shame people there, it sometimes actually does work in the context of a larger society as well. Next, we're turning to social order. Social order is a group's usual and customary social arrangements. Obviously, these things are always subject to change, but the general idea is that the people in the group essentially know their roles, know their niches. This could be a good thing or it could be a bad thing. Obviously, you want some social mobility. You want the ability of people to move from place to place based on, or from role to role, based on merit and based on their contributions. Social stratification, which is a similar concept to a social order, is the idea of inequalities between nations. In other words, having some rich countries and some poor countries. The four basic types of nations are the most industrialized nations, primarily consisting of the United States, Europe, most of maybe Western Europe, Northern Europe, Japan, a few other countries like that. The industrializing nations, countries that are developing, catching up to that first world, so to speak, sometimes referred to like as the BRAC countries and a few other countries like that. BRAC meaning Brazil, I think R is Russia, and then you have India, China, and a few other countries, South Africa maybe, a few countries like that that are not quite on the level of the Western countries, not quite on the level of the United States and Eastern and Western Europe, but are certainly closing the gap. The least industrialized nations, mainly sub-Saharan African countries, many Asian countries, like Bangladesh, Afghanistan, places like that. Then you've got the oil-rich countries, countries that don't produce a lot except that they happens to have a lot of oil. Saudi Arabia, Iraq, countries like that. Now, an explanation as to why, there are many different, obviously, theories as to why there is this global stratification, although there definitely is. One possibility is simply a culture of poverty. Countries are reliant on other countries or other to give them what they need to survive. Some nations have been in poverty from one generation to the next, and they rely on tradition instead of experimenting with new technology. Countries that simply are not used to developing new and innovative products. Similar to stratification, it was based on systems that thankfully don't really apply to a large extent in the Western world today, although these all did exist traditionally, and of course they also do exist, unfortunately, in some countries today, and that is the slavery system, or a caste system. Excuse me. A caste system is the idea of a rigid system where somebody who's born into one class or one caste will always be in that caste. The old Indian system where you had a caste system where the caste that you were born into, the level you were born into, the social plateau that you were born into is pretty much where you were stuck. There was really no way to move from caste to caste. And slaves did the same thing. Slaves, it's virtually impossible for a slave to become free, although I guess it did happen in all levels of slavery society. It was certainly very rare. For example, in the Roman world, where slaves were basically, they were captured in war, or they were sold into slavery by virtue of punishment for a crime. They weren't necessarily worse people in terms of skills, in terms of abilities, but for whatever reason, circumstance thrust them into the role as a slave, and they were viewed, of course, as property of the owner, but they were sometimes very important people who assisted their owner in various ways. Then other slavery systems, like we had in the United States slavery system until the Civil War, whereas slaves were viewed as inferior and were treated as property, treated with really no rights of their own. Then we have the current United States class system, in which there's a lot more social mobility, and of course the class system in the U.S. is a lot less rigid than certainly other systems that were relevant to, certainly caste systems or slavery systems, but still, there are some unfortunate similarities, and that is birth very often determines educational opportunities, economic opportunities, and social opportunities. People who are born into rich families that have good schools and well-established society are at a tremendous advantage against people who were born into poverty and were born into inner cities where they don't really have the same opportunities, where they don't have the same culture, they don't have the same structure. And people are generally stay within the class of their parents. There is, of course, a level of mobility, but more often than not, people live their lives in the same basic class as their parents. Sometimes a class, the rich, the 1%, the poor, the middle class, upper middle class, lower middle class, the working class, are sometimes referred to as a socioeconomic class. You hear that word a lot. Socioeconomic meaning social, in terms of who you associate with and who will associate with you, and economic in terms of how much money, how much resources you have access to. So there are some differences, of course, as we discussed before. In the caste system, social mobility was often impossible, but in our system, in the class system, there is a great potential for mobility in terms of achievement, individual effort, luck even. But social mobility is a little bit less likely because of the fact that people who are in lower classes tend to not be given the same opportunities as people who are in the higher classes. I don't know if I agree with this. The upper class does this to maintain power and wealth. In fact, I'm just going to cut that because I think that's kind of political and controversial and not really 100% accurate. But anyway, the point is that mobility happens. Social mobility certainly does happen in the United States, but sometimes one of the issues as to what the best socioeconomic political system is social mobility. Social mobility, how often people can be born into a lower class and move up, is the sort of thing that sometimes defines the success of equality in an economic system. The British have, somewhat similar situation to the United States. Classes are maintained from generation to generation. Britain is a core nation, which is one of the first nations in which industrial capitalism was developed, very similar to the United States in that respect. Okay, but let's go back again and discuss the four types of nations that we looked at before. You have the most industrialized nations, basically the EEOC, the Economic Employment, not the EEOC, that's the OECD, the Organization for Economic something Development. Whatever. Anyway, the point is these countries that are really at the top of the world in terms of gross national product and economic outputs. You have the industrializing nations, Mexico, Russia, Lithuania, Hungary, Poland, Eastern Europe. I don't know if I'd put Ireland in that category. I think Ireland is, if I'm not mistaken, is an OECD member. Yeah, Ireland is an OECD member, so I don't know what it was doing there. But anyway, these are industrialized nations. Countries like China, India have the same thing. Then you've got the least industrialized nations, countries, some Middle Eastern countries, some African countries, etc. Then you've got the oil-rich nations in the Middle East. They're not really industrializing because they're not necessarily developing in terms of progress, but they also can't really be considered not industrialized because they have the wealth. Some Middle Eastern oil countries have wealth that's on par with the richest countries in the world. For example, if you look at GDP per capita, gross domestic product per capita, I think Norway and the United States are like at the top of the world, but also Saudi Arabia and a couple of other Middle Eastern countries are also right at that top level, even higher than many Western Europe countries. Even though they're not as economically productive, they have oil, which makes them much more wealthy. I mean, you have situations where the people are unemployed, but countries like United Arab Emirates with Dubai is its really glittering capital, one of the most glittering cities in the world. But that's because they have oil money and they use that money to hire people from other countries like the Philippines to come in and build these enormous hotels and these enormous resorts. It doesn't necessarily filter down to the benefit of the common people in the country. Now we're going to move on to a discussion of wealth and government control of that wealth, and how wealth and wealth of a nation, wealth of individuals, plays in with the idea of politics and the idea of society. First of all, the question that comes up first is, to what extent can the government control the economy? What extent the government can control technology? The answer is, to some extent the government can, but of course there are some areas the government has very little control over. Email, internet communications, there's just so much of it, the government cannot really control it. But the government certainly can control economic output and economic trade, tariffs, wherein you tax imports in order to protect your manufacturing industries, etc. One example of government, an interesting idea, an interesting phenomenon based on specific government rules, was the idea of the maquiladoras, or the maquiladora. I'm sorry if I'm pronouncing that wrong, but a maquiladora is a manufacturing operation in a zone that's kind of duty-free, tariff-free, tax-free, like a free trade zone. Kind of like a similar concept to when you buy whiskey in a duty-free shop when you're flying out of the country or flying back into the country. These zones were established, are in places. They're manufacturing plants or factories that are established in places where you don't have to worry about import taxation. The main the main idea here in terms of the United States are Mexican factories where people go in because of the fact that we have free trade with Mexico in a lot of ways. There was NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, and the idea is because of the fact, let's say for example, we have an American company that needs to manufacture things cheaply. Now, to manufacture things cheaply, very often they have to leave the United States because the United States workers demand higher wages than companies sometimes want to pay. So they can set up a country in Mexico, set up a factory in Mexico where these are produced and then shipped back to the United States and sold in the United States. And because of the free trade rules, the entire Mexico is really a free trade zone. In the old days, there were specific free trade zones. Now, really, after NAFTA, the whole Mexico is pretty much a free trade zone, where American companies can set up plants in Mexico without having to worry about trade restrictions that would apply if they set up the same factory in China or Taiwan or India. It's not that people don't have manufacturing in China, they do, but there are certain advantages to using Mexico because of the free trade that exists between the United States and Mexico. Wealth in sociology means the value of a person's property minus that person's debt. It's a little different than income. Sometimes in terms of when people are called rich, that could be because they have a lot of wealth or because they have a lot of income. People might be rich and they have a nice house and a nice car, but they might not actually have any wealth. Maybe they make $500,000 a year, but spend $500,000 a year. So they're rich because they have nice stuff, but they may not actually be. They use nice things and they go on nice parties and vacations and things like that, so people would assume that they're rich, but they might not actually have necessarily wealth. The top 20% of Americans earn nearly half of the national income. I don't think that's an accurate stat. Yeah, I just looked it up. It's more like the top 10% of Americans earn nearly half the national income. According to another stat, the top 1% in terms of earning earn about 20% of the nation's income. So about 1% of the people earn 20% of the money. The poor, of course, are people who earn on the bottom end of that spectrum. Here's a pretty incredible chart that I have over here, where the bottom 90% of people are earning an average of like 35,000 or so, whereas the top 0.01%, which is the top 10,000th, earn, as of 2006, which is a while ago, the disparity is even greater now. You're talking about 17 million. So you can see how far it goes up when you get toward the very top of the spectrum. You can see the disparity here in terms of the percentile. Like if you're in the 50th percentile, it means you earn more than half the people and less than half the people. So over here, the 50th percentile, the median person, the middle person in the country, earns about $42,000, whereas you can see the 99th percentile, you're talking about over $500,000. So you can see as it gets higher, the incomes go up dramatically as you get towards that top 1%, so to speak. The poor, of course, children in the United States are most likely to be part of the population living in poverty, and I think the reason for that is, generally speaking, and this is true throughout the world, people who are rich tend to have fewer children, people who are poor tend to have more children, so children more likely, on average, are going to be more towards the poorer class. Then you've got this idea of the influence, or the distinction, or the connection between politics and money. Most U.S. presidents have been millionaire white men and came from families that have been rich for generations. And the constant debate between government involvement in the economy is people who are poorer, people who are in the working class, people who don't make much money, want government intervention to make everybody financially secure, whereas people who are wealthy, have more money, would like the government to stay out of it and let them keep their money, essentially. You saw a lot about that in the 2012 election. between President Obama and Governor Romney. You had a lot of talk about the 1%. You had a lot of talk about Romney saying that 47%. There was that quote where he said that 47% of the people rely on the government, and so are not going to vote for me anyway. Or they want the government. They want there to be big government. They want there to be higher taxes, which I guess to some extent is certainly true. Then you have, of course, mixed statuses, where just because somebody is of high wealth doesn't necessarily mean that they're of high social standing. Social class could be based on property, which is wealth. It could be based on prestige, or it could be based on power. Now, there is a consistency. People who are wealthier do tend to be more prestigious, and people who are wealthier also tend to have more power from a political perspective, but that's not always the case. Sometimes there is status inconsistency, where you have high rank in property, but a low rank in prestige. People can be very wealthy, but not liked by people. Certainly, you have the Koch brothers, for example, who are very wealthy, but they're also very hated by a lot of people, just based on their politics and based on their wealth also. People who have this inconsistency, maybe people who just made a lot of money and aren't established in the higher social circles, tend to be politically radical, and they tend to also have there's an adjustment. I mean, somebody wins the lottery and wins $25 million. It may seem fantastic, and it is fantastic. I mean, I would love to win $25 million, but there's also a challenge to normalize expectations and normalize the way now you're all of a sudden in this life of rich people and you're not used to dealing with it. That certainly is something that people who do find they say crazy statistics. I mean, I heard statistics that here, one statistic is that 90% of lottery winners go through their winnings in 5 years or less. I mean, it sounds crazy. People win $25 million, and within 5 years they're back to being whatever they were beforehand. I guess because they're just not used to it. They're not used to having that kind of money, and they don't invest it properly, and they don't save it properly. Instead, they do things with it they make decisions that aren't really very smart. The social class also affects health of people, believe it or not. Well, I'm sure you can believe it. First of all, medical care is expensive, and so their health insurance is very expensive. Those of you who have dealt with insurance know this already. Health insurance is very expensive, and therefore people who don't have money have a tough time getting the same level of health care as people who do have money. Social class opens and closes doors to medical care. People who are higher in terms of prestige maybe get admission to better hospitals. People who can pay obviously get admission to better hospitals. And lifestyle is also interesting. The higher the class, generally speaking, the healthier the lifestyle. In the old days, people who were rich ate and people who were poor couldn't eat. Today, pretty much everybody has enough money and everybody has enough access to food. It's just a question of what they eat. People who are in the lower classes tend to be more prone to smoking, eating fatty fast foods, rather than fast foods are cheap. Restaurants may take a lot of pains, fancy restaurants, steakhouses may take a lot of pains to serve healthy foods and to try to make that 24-ounce steak as healthy as possible. Or, serve you like a gourmet salad that is healthy and costs $30. But the point is that people who are in lower classes, in the working class, may go to McDonald's or something for $1 burger, and it's certainly not very healthy. Being overweight, abusing drugs and alcohol, not getting exercise. Not that those things are unique to people who are poor, but it's just more likely to afflict people who are poor than people who are rich. Upper class people are more body conscious. They want to make good public impression, enjoy the benefits of their wealth, and so they're more likely to focus more on staying healthy than people who are poor and just have no time to focus on staying healthy. They really have to just make a living and feed their family. Stress also. Life is harder for the poor lower class people, and so therefore they tend to undergo more stress, and that could cause health problems as well. In terms of why there is poverty, I mean, I don't know if we really need to figure out exactly why there is poverty. The reason why there's poverty is because people don't make enough money, but there are various explanations as to why poverty exists. There's social structure, which focuses on discrimination and changes in the job market, the idea that people who are in poverty, especially people of ethnic minorities, tend to be discriminated against when it comes to job potential. There's also a cultural explanation that focuses on the social situation which they're born into. People who are born into inner cities where there's, where the attitude is that education is not good, or education is nerdy, or education is for is for upper crust people, and doesn't focus on it, doesn't incentivize it, doesn't make it attractive to people. Certainly is one explanation. And then, of course, there are individual explanations which can focus on the individual characteristics of the person. Obviously, no one answer is correct or incorrect. All of these things have to be taken into account to one degree or another. Then, in terms of the labor force in general, of employment, there's this idea of reserve labor force, which is an interesting idea that sometimes during economic recessions, there are people who are obviously the government doesn't go to an individual and say, hey, you can't work. But what the government sometimes does is establishes, maybe by increasing welfare, by increasing benefits, increasing unemployment benefits, establishes the fact that there are some people who are just simply not working for jobs. And if the economy does recover and we need more workers to produce more stuff, then we've got people waiting in the wings that are ready to fill those jobs. But let's say by increasing unemployment benefits, you know that a certain percentage of people are just going to drop out of the workforce and just take the unemployment benefits and not work. And that has the benefit right now of making it less competitive for people who do need the jobs and who will not be incentivized by the extra benefits to leave the workforce. And it also allows, like I said before, more people to enter the workforce if it's necessary. The conflict theory of labor believes that the purpose of the government welfare is to maintain a reserve labor force. And Social Security benefits, that's really where the government pays people in terms of retirement, and also in some situations even before retirement, is a result of the struggle between competing interest groups, where the idea is that the government should establish at least a safety net for people who are unemployed or people who retire, people who can't work for whatever reason. The next aspect of our sociological discussion is a discussion of ethnicity, stereotypes, minority power, minority rights, things like that. Ethnicity means cultural heritage. Tracing a family line is ethnic work. Ethnicity can be based on race, it can be based on culture, it can be based on religion, it can be based on anything. The United States is a country that is fairly unique in the history of the world, in that the United States is really kind of a melting pot of different ethnicities. European countries, especially in the old days, maybe not as much today, but in the old days was pretty monotonous. There was pretty homogeneous. Basically, there was one major ethnic group and maybe a few minorities, but 90% of the people or 95% of the people really belonged to the same ethnic group. So America became a melting pot. Of course, now many Americans are interested in discovering their roots. They call this a tossed salad because it is so diverse, and the idea that a melting pot, it's not really a melting pot. A melting pot is when you take all the different flavors when you're cooking something and you mix it all together and it's all just one big solution, one big liquid. A tossed salad is, well, it's a mix, but you still have the tomatoes, which are distinct from the cucumbers, which are distinct from the lettuce, which are distinct from the radishes, whatever. The point is that in the United States, you have all these different people that are mixed together, but they're not really completely mixed in with other cultures. It's not like where people move into a place and completely assimilate. In the United States, you have people who don't really assimilate that much. They retain the culture from their previous ethnicity. White ethnics in America were sometimes referred to as, or the original immigrants, the ones who established the United States and were the original ethnic group, the original majority, sometimes referred to as WASPs, and WASPs are still a plurality. WASPs are white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, which means white people from Britain who are Protestant Christians, as opposed to Catholics, and as opposed to other religions, of course. WASPs are still a plurality. In other words, there are probably still more WASPs in the United States than there are any other single ethnic group, but clearly they're very, very, very far from a majority. I don't know what percentage there are in terms of WASPs in the United States. I'm going to guess, maybe 10%. Well, I can't find any reliable statistics for how many WASPs there are in the United States, but certainly it's nowhere near a majority. Research, of course, is being done as to why race and ethnicity factor into medical decisions, but of course these things obviously do have an impact on so many different facets of life. And one reason is because you have this phenomenon called stereotyping. Stereotyping is where stereotype is where there's a widely accepted image of a particular type of person. Now, that's people see somebody of a particular ethnic group and say, oh, well, that person is probably this. That person is Asian, he's probably good at math. That would be an example of a relatively benign stereotype. And, there are other stereotypes out there that you can probably figure out for yourself. But stereotypes, of course, can be very dangerous. First of all, they can become self-fulfilling prophecies. If somebody is assumed that they're not going to be good at a job, well, then people may not hire the person, and then the person might not get the training that they need, and then in fact that person might not be good at the job because of the fact that they were victimized by stereotyping, because they didn't get the job and experience in the first place, and so it's kind of like a self-fulfilling prophecy. Stereotypes affect our interactions when we meet people for the first time. Maybe because we've had experience in the past with that person, or because the media or society has convinced us something about a group of people or a type of person. We then assume when we meet the person that the person will conform to that stereotype. Obviously, that could be dangerous as well. A related concept is the concept of prejudice. Prejudice is a biased opinion that's not based on reason or actual experience. People could gain prejudice by influence of society. We hear that a particular group of people have some negative characteristics, or by imitating others who have prejudice. Our parents or our friends or people in our schools have prejudice. We could pick up those same things, or we can develop prejudice from learning from the people around. Sometimes, we have a bad experience with a member of a particular group, and so we assume that applies to everybody else in the group as well. We dislike people in that group, even though it may have been just one individual. So people can become prejudiced because of part of their cultural values, or they join prejudice groups. For example, this study by Kathleen Blee showed that people who joined the Ku Klux Klan might not have been prejudiced before they joined, but after they joined, they may have become prejudiced because they learned from the other members in the group. Certainly, prejudice is something that is not inherent. It's something that people are taught. People are taught to be prejudiced, either consciously or unconsciously, or or for their own experiences make them prejudiced for whatever reason. And the victim of stereotyping and the victims of prejudice are typically minority groups. Now, minority groups could be racial minorities, they could be religious minorities, could be pretty much any group. One, of course, example of a minority group that's been the victim of prejudice is African Americans. And just one example of a manifestation of this is that due to internalizing the dominant group, namely in this case the white group, a study actually showed that African American men viewed light-skinned African American women as more attractive than dark-skinned women, just because of the fact that it's closer to the dominant group of the society. Now, women are not really a minority. I mean, it's it's kind of a misnomer. I mean, women are over 50% of the population, so to call women of a minority stretches the definition of the word minority a little bit. But still, they're considered minority because of the fact that, generally speaking, in our society, men are the power holders or the power brokers in the society. And some manifestations of women who have suffered prejudice and have suffered suffered from not being part of the dominant gender in that case. One example is the glass ceiling, the concept that there is an invisible barrier keeping women from reaching the top in the workplace. Again, whether it's completely true or not, whether it happens sometimes or frequently or less frequently, more frequently, is not 100% clear. There's certainly a lot of discussion, a lot of debate on that, but the idea that women could rise in the workplace, but when it came to the very top levels, when it came to being the CEO or when it came to being very high, it was much more difficult for a woman to get there than for a man to get there that was similarly situated. And because of the stereotype that women suffer. The stereotype that men tend to stereotype women as being less capable of leadership, but stronger in public relations and human resources. I mean, the idea, of course, being that stereotyping is not necessarily always bad. Women sometimes are looked at as more reliable, but maybe not as dominant in terms of leadership, maybe not as entrepreneurial, maybe not as creative when it comes to businesses, not as decisive. So women are less likely to have mentors, the mentors men have, because these are the people that in previous generations ran the companies, and they're more likely to mentor other men than they are to mentor women. Even in female jobs, like nurses, teachers, librarians, social workers, studies have shown that men are more likely to be promoted, and men, generally speaking, on average, again, according to some studies, I've seen other studies that dispute this, but there are many studies that say that men tend to make more money than women, even with equal experience and training. I've seen other studies that say that once you account for all the other factors, like lifestyle choices, children, things like that, then things tend to even out. But again, there's a lot of debate about that. I'm not going to sit here and tell you that this is true, or this is false. I'll just tell you that this has been discussed a lot, this has been alleged a lot, and there's been a lot of study and debate on this issue. The child penalty is the idea of gender discrimination that manifests itself in the fact that women who care for their children at home then make less money because they have less experience because of the fact that they were home raising their children. Then you have interesting, people don't really think of it, but how about the elderly? The elderly, we don't think of them as a minority necessarily, but there could be certain aspects of stereotyping that cause the elderly to suffer some sort of prejudice. The elderly certainly in the old days were respected and looked up to, whereas today TV ads and other forms of media portray the elderly as unimportant and stereotyped, kind of helpless. People who like suck money out of the economy without really giving back, and people who are old, tend to have more trouble hanging on at the workplace because maybe other people look at them as being not as competent or not as aggressive, not as energetic, etc. And all these things, of course, have contributed to social inequality. Social inequality means an unequal distribution of the product of the economy. A hunter-gatherer society, when people are moving in the old days, old days, people are moving place to place, and capturing what they need to capture in order to survive. There's not that much inequality. It's kind of like a commune, kind of like a situation where everybody works together. Whereas once you had societies that were more settled, pastoral and agricultural societies, you had leftover stuff after things were produced. The hunter-gatherers would shoot the animal, cook the animal, and eat the animal. Well, if you have a factory that cooks 1,000 animals, and there's only 500 that are needed for eating within the factory or within the commune, well, now you got 500 more animals that you can sell to somebody else. And then there's profits. And profits mean that the people who control the company, the people who own the company, the people who are the capitalists, make the money. And that leads to social inequality. Of course, that also is a good thing because somebody has to it gives everybody the incentive to run the factory more efficiently. But again, that's the old communism capitalism debate that I'm not going to sit here and solve in a video that's a couple of hours long, that's for sure. Okay, lifespan is something that is also affected by society. Lifespan is the maximum length that's possible for a species, or how long a person lives. I mean, there could be average lifespan, which is approximately how long the average one lives, or there could be maximum lifespan. Men are more likely to be involved in killing, and of course men are more often the victims of killings than women are. Generally speaking, when it comes to murder, when it comes to homicide, men are much more likely to die in that way. Which is one of the reasons, of course, why there are more women in society than men. It's interesting that when it comes to actual birth, there are actually more boys born than girls. Again, the reason I believe, at least I've read, is that in terms of biology, of course, the all fertilized eggs have an X chromosome on the pair that determines gender, and the sperm cells with Y chromosomes produce boys, and the sperm cells with X chromosomes produce girls, and the sperm cells with Y chromosomes are slightly smaller and therefore slightly faster and slightly more likely to make it to fertilization than sperm cells with X chromosomes. But but the point is that even though boys have slightly higher birth rate, overall women are a little bit more frequent than men in society, and one of the reasons is because men are more likely to get killed than are women. An interesting sociological phenomenon that occurred in the United States really from after World War II through the mid-1960s, they say 1945 to 1964, the baby boom generation. The baby boom generation, during that time, a relatively large number of babies were born as compared to before and after. Again, there are various reasons for that. One reason is because the soldiers were all home from the war and they went and started families. Maybe they were more into creating life because of the fact that they had seen, so much of the World War II generation wiped out by war. And because of the baby boom, now the baby boomers are starting to reach retirement age. Somebody who was born in 1945 today would be about 70 years old, 71 years old, give or take. So we're talking about people, the older baby boomers are already retired. Even the younger baby boomers are, coming up on retirement. And the fact that that generation was bigger than the subsequent generation or the previous generation includes a job boom. When baby boomers retire, that might help unemployment. As baby boomers retire, more people are retiring, and then the younger people, there are fewer workers to take their place, meaning that there may be less competition for those jobs. The elderly will become more powerful politically and economically because they're a higher percentage of the population. There are more elderly voters than there used to be because of the baby boom generation becoming elderly, and they're more likely to vote in older politicians. Medicare and Social Security, which are for retirement benefits, have increased in costs, increased in payouts, which will place a greater tax burden on the workers. Social Security depends on there being a lot of workers to pay for, the various retirement benefits. If there are more retirees, well, then the workers may have to pay more money in terms of Social Security tax and Medicare tax to pay for the elderly. And industry leaders, the government candidates for office will have to change their priorities to accommodate aging population because the voting power, the number of voters, will skew more towards elderly people than ever before because there's such a large generation of elderly people now. Let's now look at the sociological aspect of authority, namely government, and all sorts of different aspects of society require authority. And the first thing regarding authority is the idea of this rational legal authority. Rational legal authority is the idea of authority based on written laws, United States Code, state codes, any kind of written statute, written law. There's also authority based on traditional authority, based on tradition, not necessarily written, not necessarily code, but because this is the way it's always been and this is what society expects out of you. So therefore the expectation can apply in that respect as well. Authority also very often depends on charismatic leaders. Charismatic leaders means leaders that have the ability to draw people to listen to them, to draw people towards them. These are followers that these are things that are really required in order for people to respect the government. There need to be politicians with charisma that are able to get the people to follow them. For example, in the United States, we've got a rational legal authority, also a traditional authority. We've got a representative democracy, which elects candidates that we believe will represent our interests in the local government, state government, federal government, etc. You've got two major parties, the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, of course. Republican Party more represents economic free market capitalism, Democratic Party more working class values. But that is the general. Obviously, you have a lot of crossover in terms of the two parties, but the idea is that you have this two-party system that depends on legal authority for codes, for court cases, etc., etc. In the United States government, you've got distribution of power. You've got checks and balances, which means you don't, rather than giving just all the power to one king or to a few oligarchs, instead you have a distribution of power among many different aspects of the government. You've got the legislative branch, which makes the law. That's Congress in the federal system, state legislatures in the state system. You've got the executive branch, who enforces the law. That's the president and the entire group of administrative agencies on the federal level, the Department of Justice and the U.S. attorneys and all that, including the president, of course. And then you've got the judicial system, which are the courts, headed, of course, by the United States Supreme Court. And the reason for this, the purpose of this distribution, is to try to make sure that no individual branch dominates. Each of them have checks and balances on the other. The courts can strike down as unconstitutional a law or a presidential action. The president appoints the judges, and the president can veto legislation. Congress can impeach the president. Congress can impeach judges. So there are all sorts of checks and balances that each have over the other. And pluralism in distributing power keeps the United States government from turning against its citizens, and the idea of giving the people the power to check their government and giving the people the power to re-elect and throw people out if necessary. The opposite of that, the opposite of distributing the power and having checks and balances, is totalitarianism. Totalitarianism is a dictatorship, whereas one individual is an absolute dictator, or a small group of individuals might be. An oligarchy could also be a form of totalitarianism. Nazi Germany, of course, was an example of totalitarianism, and there have been a lot of other examples of that, where you have one individual or one small group is not restricted by a constitution, a law, or anything. Another political force that, of course, is relevant to rule is this idea of terrorism. Terrorism is not necessarily by a government or against a government. Terrorism is the use of violence or threats of violence to produce fear in order to attain political objectives. Basically killing civilians, not necessarily because you don't like the civilians. The idea of a terrorist is not necessarily to blow up something in order to kill the individuals. They may not necessarily have anything against the individuals who they're blowing up, but they want people to be afraid of them, and they want that fear to scare the opponent into making some sort of a political change. So just for example, terrorism in the Middle East. Now, of course, the war in Iraq is, for the most part, quiet, well, a little quiet, and you still have ISIS now, of course, but that's not really a direct conflict with the United States. So terrorists in Iraq don't have the means to confront the U.S. and its coalition's forces head-on, when the U.S. was in Iraq in much more strength. So instead, they used more deceptive ways to achieve their goals, and that was essentially to blow random things up and therefore cause political upheaval. And this applies, of course, for many different scenarios. In the Vietnam War, for example, the North Vietnamese were able to convince the United States to just give up the effort, essentially. So no specific government may be funding terrorism, but that makes fighting terrorism much more difficult. If there's no specific government that's supporting them, or can be proven, or you can be sure that they're supporting them, then who are you really going to fight? You can't necessarily identify who the individual terrorists are. And when you do, you have to realize that these terrorists may be functioning inside of other sovereign countries. And going into those other sovereign countries creates political problems. Even going in and getting Osama bin Laden, for example, when the United States finally figured out where bin Laden was in Pakistan, when they decided to go in and get him, well, obviously there were the tactical issues of the operation. Making sure that everything was going to run smoothly was not an easy thing to do. But then there was the risk of upsetting the Pakistanis and saying, basically the United States went in there and had soldiers run a military operation on foreign soil without the permission of the Pakistani government. Now, the United States government, of course, made the judgment that it was worth it, that it was worth going into Pakistan and running a military operation on somebody else's soil for the purpose of getting Osama bin Laden. But that's the sort of problem that you deal with when you're dealing with terrorism. You don't know exactly what to strike. If it's a foreign country, you pretty much know where that country's capital is. You know where that country's leaders are. Terrorism, you don't always know exactly where their central administration is and who those people are. And then, of course, you have the ultimate problem that could come from totalitarian rule and from authority gone wild in general, and that is genocide. Genocide means the intentional killing of a large group of people of a particular nation or a particular ethnic group. And unfortunately, of course, there are many examples that we can point to: the massacre of the Native Americans in the 1800s, the Holocaust, the Armenian genocide during World War I, where the Turks killed millions of Armenians, the slaughter of the Tutsis in Rwanda by the Hutu tribe, killing Whoa. I don't know if I would call that genocide. Okay. Sorry about that. Okay. Now we're going to move to the part of the course that deals with sociology when it comes to the relationships that we have and choose for ourselves. The first aspect, of course, for sociological relationships is the relationship of the family, which is probably the primary relationship that we all have. There are many aspects, of course, to the family relationship, but when we talk about relationships, the first place we have to start with is family. Family sociologically simply means two or more people related by blood, marriage, or adoption. A blended family is something like a non-traditional family, when a husband or wife brings a child into a new family from a prior relationship. There are many different types of families. There's the nuclear family, which is simply the father, mother, and their children. The extended family, which includes grandparents, extended relatives, etc. Family of orientation means a family in which an individual grows up. It could be an adopted child who is not a natural, not a biological child, but still is considered a child for purposes of family because the person grew up in the environment. A family of procreation simply means two parents and one child. In other words, the family that's formed when the couple have their first child. Of course, that's a very big step because it is the change from just simply a couple to a family. And in terms of family, I guess the central unit of a family is the marriage, which is usually based on a relationship that precedes the ceremony. I mean, there are also some types of marriages that could apply, common law marriages, where you don't even need a ceremony. But a marriage is a way to establish a predictable relationship upon which to build a family, of course. People with similar characteristics tend to marry each other. People in similar ages, similar religions, similar ethnic groups, similar socioeconomic status. All of these things are predictable channels of choice of a marriage partner. Not 100%, obviously, we all know that, but generally speaking, wealthy white people tend to marry other wealthy white people. People in certain religions tend to marry the same religions, etc., etc. Marriage, of course, has other, and that's really part of what we're discussing. 93% of people marry within their race. There's an interesting little stat over here. Propinquity is the correct way to pronounce it, I believe. The closer the couple is together distance-wise, the more likely a successful relationship will develop. It's interesting that I never really thought of it that way, but the closer the spouses that stand very far apart when they're talking to each other, not that it's inherently bad, but it's indicative of maybe a lack of closeness that could be a problem when it comes to marriage. And marriage, of course, unfortunately, in the United States today, about 50% of all marriages end up in divorce, so that's obviously a big part of the family as well. The divorce rate for remarried people without children is about the same rate as after the first marriage. So essentially, divorce spreads across many different types of spectrum, many different areas. People who are less likely to divorce are people who get married after college. In other words, rather than when they're very young, as opposed to getting married when they're teenagers or low 20s. People who get married a little bit later on, people who have strong moral values, people who share the same religion, generally speaking, tend to divorce less than other couples. Obviously, there's a big problem, not necessarily a problem, but a big challenge when it comes to relationship between the father and the children after divorce. The most common pattern is for the mother to be the primary caretaker and for the father to continue to see the children frequently after divorce. A visitation pattern, maybe every second weekend, something, and then maybe some holidays, whatever it is. That is the normal way most people do things that way. Another pattern is that fathers just don't have much contact with their children, maybe because they moved to a different city, maybe because the fathers, run away to a different area, want to have a new family, whatever the case may be. In fact, according to this statistic, only about 38% of children living apart from their father see their father very frequently, whereas over 60% of children do not. Fictive kin, I guess similar to the word fiction, means kin that aren't really kin, relatives that aren't really relatives. Kin means your relatives. Well, fictive kin are people that you share resources with and kind of share a life with a little bit as though they were relatives, but they're not actually relatives. Neighbors that share the same resources when someone's in need of help, maybe a condo association, a group, a commune, people that may not be relatives with each other, but live almost as though they're relatives, can almost kind of take the place of relatives in some cases where where people are not really close to their actual relatives for whatever reason. Our next phase of the course is the transmission of values from generation to generation, really kind of establishing a contiguous society. And obviously, different societies have very different ways in which values are transmitted. Just to give you two examples, in the United States, emphasized core values from one generation to the next that stressed capitalism and democracy as core values. Democracy being anti-totalitarianism and anti-oligarchy, anti-having a monarchy, anti-having one group of people getting too powerful. Whereas in the Soviet Union, you also had the same idea where there was this idea or this goal of society to try to transmit values, but the goal was a lot different. The stress, the allegiance, the stress here, when I was a kid, at least before communism fell, the idea was the Soviet Union were the bad guys. And Soviet Union, their education taught that the United States were the bad guys. And they stressed socialism and communism as being the ideal. We said that democracy is good and capitalism is good and communism is evil. And they taught that capitalism is evil because it's took advantage of the workers, and the communism was fair, and there's no need for democracy because democracy is a silly way of doing things anyway. So, we almost take it for granted that democracy is a good thing, but that's because we were taught that. Other societies may not have been taught the same thing. In the United States in general, there are certain values that tend to dominate. Individualism. The idea that someone can start from very humble beginnings and become very important. Social mobility, we consider. We don't have such great social mobility, but certainly social mobility is considered an ideal, where people who are poor, the Americans love a rags to riches story, where people who are very poor become rich because they invent something or because they achieve something. Efficiency and practicality, we don't necessarily focus on rules and rules for the sake of rules like they do, for example, maybe in Germany a little bit more. In the United States, efficiency and practicality, being creative in terms of getting things done is stressed. Science and technology, certainly, very, very important in the United States in our education system. The whole Silicon Valley in California, where they're developing computers and computer software, computer technology, very, very much held in esteem. Material comfort is considered very important in the United States. Achievement and individual success. Freedom and democracy, two of the buzzwords that we hear all the time. Equality, again, not always achieved, but certainly strived for. Education, religiosity, certainly. Religion in the United States still holds a very strong presumption or a very strong reputation. Hard work. And the idea of group superiority. Group superiority is people working together. Now that may contradict freedom, democracy, and equality a little bit if you're going, or certainly freedom. The idea of group superiority is to sacrifice your own interest for the interest of society, whereas freedom is really more like the idea that you're sacrificing you're not worrying about general interest, you're worrying about yourself. So some of these values do contradict each other in various ways, but that doesn't mean that we don't at least strive for all of these to one extent or another. Then we've got the issue of discipline, which generally applies to society in general and also, of course, to the individual raising children and raising a family. Different cultures deal with discipline in different ways. Asian Americans tend to use shame or guilt to control the behavior of those who misbehave. Maybe people who get bad grades are considered dishonorable, and that teaches or that convinces children to work as hard as they can to avoid being considered dishonorable. African Americans tend to use more physical control, physical punishment, than do those coming from European backgrounds, than white people. Americans are trying to use more positive focusing methods, certainly in the last few decades, than punishment. Punishment was a lot more common in terms of harsh discipline in the 50s and 60s in that era than it is today, where you have more and more people thinking that the best thing to do is not necessarily to punish children, but to give them positive reinforcement and to convince them to behave properly because they want to behave. I mean, just by contrast, to give you an example, let's look at the way Japan does it. Japan, of course, has a lot of success in terms of the way they run their society, and they run it in a very different way than the United States does. Japan, unlike the United States, which is focused on individualism, in Japan they focus more on group solidarity, a group-centered approach that centers on uniformity. Solidarity within the group, making sure that people are consistent with each other and that people work to the goals, to the general goals of society. Now, of course, cooperation is contradicted when students apply for college, because when students apply for college, if there may only be a limited number of spots, which used to be much more so than the case is today, as we'll see in a few minutes why that is, but in the past, students were admitted to college on the basis of their test scores, and so therefore all the students needed to have high test scores. How good a college you'd get into, and therefore how good a job you'd have, and how much money you'd make in the long term, was really dependent on how well you did on these scores. And these scores became tremendously competitive for individuals. And so for the purposes of these tests and the purposes of these scores, really individuality won out more so than solidarity with the group, even though solidarity with the group was considered the ideal thing that people should generally look to. Today, on the other hand, there's a low birth rate, and therefore there aren't that many students coming up, and colleges they are competing for the students rather than the students competing for the college spots, because there are lower birth rates and most of the colleges have stayed open. To continue with our discussion of education, we have this concept of dumbed down or dummied down education, and that's something that unfortunately it's a phenomenon sometimes, especially in the United States and some other countries, where you have a problem where people just aren't as into education as they used to and are settling for lower results. IQ tests measure, intelligence quotient tests measure intelligence and or acquired knowledge, and this idea of accepting mediocrity sometimes manifests itself in using very easy questions or dumbing down grading scale like the New York State Regents, where when I was a kid in high school you used to have to actually get 65% of the exam right to pass, but then later on when they saw people were failing, so they changed it to where if you got like 45% of the test right, they would give you a 65 anyway. They had these rubrics where you don't actually have to get 65% right to get a 65 on the test. I guess they figured it's better to have people pass than to have people fail, even if they actually don't deserve to pass, but that's another issue. Then you have this idea of social promotion, passing a student to the next grade despite problems. In other words, somebody doesn't deserve necessarily to be promoted, but in order to keep them with their classmate and avoid traumatizing them by holding them back, you put the student in the next class with the rest of his or her class. And then lower SAT scores, SAT, the Scholastic Aptitude Test that people take very often in order to get into some colleges. People are scoring lower and lower on the SAT, and therefore they've had to change the scale to make it a little easier to get a higher grade. And the reason for that is less rigorous teaching, dummied down textbooks, less reading, more watching TV, more video games that are doing things to decrease the quality of education in the United States, unfortunately. It's also a result of, and maybe even partially a cause of, school violence. Sociologists found that the media is largely responsible for creating a myth that there's greater school violence. Really, there's not. School violence is a problem, but maybe not as big a problem as we think it is. When a few high-profile cases happen, school violence really maybe not quite that bad. But shootings do account for 3/4 of all school-related deaths, and boys die in school incidents 3 times the rate of girls. But of course, school violence is a problem. Even if it's not quite as big a problem as we think it is, obviously that still is a problem. Okay, let's move to the next, and I think the second to last topic of this course, and that is population theories. Theories of how populations grow, how populations move, how the dynamics of populations work, which is, of course, also a very important element to sociology. The Malthus theorem is the idea that population grows only or grows geometrically, which means it's not just doesn't just grow a little bit at a time. It grows, the population doubles and triples. I mean, if you look at the history of the world reached 1 billion people in like the 1840s, and now is well over 7 billion. It may take a long time. The extra billion people that it takes shorter and shorter every time. In other words, it grows faster than just at a consistent rate. Whereas food supply only is added to as more. So that's obviously a problem. That if there's more and more people and food supplies don't grow as much, you'll have problems feeding the world in general. Although, of course, increasing farming yield with newer technologies can certainly help in that respect. The transition from high birth and death rates to low birth and death rates is the idea that as countries become richer and as countries become more educated, as countries go from a pre-industrial system to an industrialized system, you have a lower birth rate. Interestingly enough, so it's kind of like it goes in steps. First, you have a relatively low birth rate because people don't have enough food. Then, when you start developing an economy to the point where people have plenty of food to support everybody, like when the industrialized Western nations export food and medicine to countries maybe in sub-Saharan Africa or in the Asian subcontinent, these receiving nations now have enough food and medicine to support population growth. Now they have population explosions, and then the cycle is that when it goes back, when the country becomes more educated and when the country becomes more prosperous, it just leads to a natural decrease in the birth rate based on education, based on for whatever reason. I mean, the general rule is that more advanced Western countries tend to have much lower birth rates than, let's say, Middle Eastern countries, Sub-Saharan African countries, etc. So it's really kind of like low population growth, then you become a little wealthy, and you have a high population growth, then you become more wealthy, and it decreases once again. Edge cities are important. Again, we're kind of just going through miscellaneous things over here in terms of the sociological impacts of various phenomena. An edge city is a city that is built specifically based on the transportation availability. Edge city is a cluster of buildings and services near the intersection of major highways, hotels, shopping malls, office parks, apartment complexes. Very often these things spring up because of the availability of transportation. If you have a major train station and then you build a major train station somewhere, well, then all of a sudden people are going to go. The land still might be cheap because it's not developed. So people say, I have an idea. I'm going to go buy cheap land next to that train station. And I'll build an office complex, and that way we'll be able to have workers who have a nice, convenient way to get to work. They can get to work by train, and that will of course lead to other people coming, and eventually you'll have a whole area or a whole office complex, a whole city over there. Same thing is true, of course, with highways. There's a highway exit built in an area, so people say, let's build a motel there, so that travelers who need a motel and happen to be on the highway will take advantage of it. Same thing is true with offices. We'll say, okay, that's a good, convenient place to build an office because people will have an easy time to get there. It's right off the interstate. The point is availability of transportation. Same thing is true with living, of course. People say, well, it's good, nice and convenient to live near the interstate. Generally speaking, it's more convenient to live 3 minutes away from the interstate than it is to live 15 minutes away from the interstate. Not that it's the end of the world to have to drive 15 minutes to get to the interstate, but certainly it takes you a lot longer to get to many places that you need to go. So availability of transportation causes growth of cities. And building and developing can also be affected by government policy and by economic phenomena. For example, redlining is refusing to loan or insure someone because they live in an area considered to be a poor financial risk or a problem area. Banks aren't really supposed to do this, but banks may be less likely to give people loans if they live in an area that is blighted or undeveloped or whatever the case may be. On the other hand, you have the government trying to interfere in order to help places like this, and they may turn it into what is called a federal empowerment zone, which is a form of enterprise zone that combines tax breaks and low-interest loans. If a government wants to redevelop an area, maybe revitalize a downtown, or develop an inner city by attracting businesses, the government can issue tax breaks and can issue maybe build some infrastructure in there to make it more attractive for people to come in. Many cities have done this. The famous Kilo versus New London case happened because of trying to redevelop an area where the government of New London decided they wanted to revitalize the downtown or revitalize the lakefront area, and so they wanted to foreclose on people's houses, take people's houses, give them reasonable compensation, but take people's houses in order to allow private industry to come in and build there. And then there was a whole Supreme Court case about whether they're allowed to do that, and the Supreme Court eventually said that yes, they are allowed to do that. They are allowed to take people's houses away as long as they pay them in order to revitalize a downtown by using the land to allow other private infrastructure to come in and develop over there. And similar to the idea of developing is this idea of human ecology. Ecology usually means the environment and the functioning of the environment, and human ecology is the effect of humans on the environment, also sometimes known as urban ecology, and it describes how people adapt to their environment and their motivations for trying to succeed, for crime rates, delinquency, other social phenomena. It's an entire study of the idea of what happens when humans move into an area, when people develop a city. So what motivates their actions? It's really a separate study of how, when people move into a city, what happens to that city? What happens to the crime rates? As people grow more, as you have more and more people, does the crime rate go up? What happens to the economic success of the city? It's in terms of natural ecology, people might study a place that was wiped out by a volcanic eruption in terms of first come the mosses, and then come the lichens, and then come the grasses, and then come the herbivores, and then come eventually the carnivores. Well, human ecology, in terms of if a city starts, who comes first to the city? People that are looking for bargains in houses. Who comes second? People who employ those. So human ecology is really just the study of this environment. So human ecology helps explain group behavior. It's not something that we're really covering much in this course. We just want to know what human ecology is, kind of a study, a subset of sociology, how humans impact a new environment and adapt to a new environment. And finally, we're in our last section of the course, and this deals with social change, the agents of social change, and the impediments to social change. Social change is simply a shift in the characteristics of a culture or society over time. That could happen invasion succession cycle, which is essentially when a different culture comes into an area and kind of takes over, one group of people displacing a group whose characteristics differ from their own. Maybe they're moving in because of importation, maybe they're moving in because they fought a war and won the war and chased everybody out. Either way, that's a pretty dramatic way to change the social makeup of an area. Then there are indirect transfer, where you can make the daily living conditions so terrible that people are forced to leave. So, for example, if in Tsarist Russia, where Jews had such a horrible living conditions, they emigrated to other places. That's true very often in terms of the modern way of ethnic cleansing. The modern way of getting people to move out of an area is when governments sometimes just make the conditions poor for them so that they eventually move on their own accord. Non-involvement is the method by which people sometimes react to what they consider to be adverse circumstances in a society in a way that tries to protect their own personal space, tries to maintain anonymity, so to speak. It's a way to kind of shield yourself from society. Now, it could be in a major way if you decide to go become a hermit and live out in the forest. That's one way. Or you could just do it in a subtle way or in a small way, in a day-to-day way. Listening to headphones as you go into a crowded store to avoid having to deal with other people. People see you're listening to something, so they don't wave to you and don't bother you. They just kind of figure you're in your own world because you want to be in your own world. You don't want to be in their world. Or using a newspaper to shield yourself from others when you're on a park bench, something like that. Diffusion of responsibility. Go to a place where there are fewer bystanders to help. I'm sorry, not go to a place, but diffusion of responsibility is the idea where people don't help in the emergency even though there are plenty of bystanders because they don't accept the responsibility. I mean, there have been terrible cases where people have been hurt or, attacked or whatever it is, and there have been bystanders and the bystanders didn't help. Now, one reason is because they're afraid to help. They're afraid of being hurt themselves by whatever is attacking the person in the first place, but also because people abdicate responsibility and they figure there are other people. Somebody's drowning in a pool and everybody standing around the pool thinks that somebody else is going to jump in, and nobody actually jumps in to save the person until maybe it's too late. That's a classic example of what the harm of non-involvement. Non-involvement could happen on an individual level, in the case I just described, or non-involvement can happen on a societal level, where people realize the government is doing something bad, but nobody wants to stop the government because they figure it's just too hard and somebody else is going to do it, and why should I worry about it? In the benefits of non-involvement, of course, allows people to tune out others, protect their own private world, mask their body expressions, basically not get involved in problematic circumstances and problematic situations. Whereas the dangers include that it stops the ability to be alert to possible dangers, hear instructions. People covering their eyes or covering their ears are protecting their own personal privacy, but on the other hand, they're putting themselves in a situation where they might not be able to react properly. And on a societal level, that applies for people who don't want to follow the news because they don't want to get bothered by it or whatever it is, but they're also not in a position to help with any steps that may need to be taken on a societal level to improve people. Now, computers, of course, have caused a dramatic change in how society has worked. In the past, business connections were managed by telephone, or before the telephone was managed in person. You took a train to the other office, or you walked to the other office, and it was very difficult to do business with people who were very far away. Today, businesses are technologically wired to salespeople, clients around the country. You can text people, you can email people, you can Skype people, you can FaceTime people. It's so easy to connect between people. It used to be it was hard to work with people off-site. Today you can work with people off-site. If you're disciplined enough to do it, you can work with people off-site almost as well as you can work with people on-site. Uses of computers in business are almost, too varied and voluminous to be discussed, but just to give some examples: tracking sales of items, tabulating inventory, spreadsheets, reordering, restocking, generating detailed reports. No more national border. You don't have to worry about being paid in different currencies because these things can be done through online banking, and they can happen instantaneously, where people can be paid and pay in other currencies and in other manners and using other banks that would have been impossible before computers. Then there's the idea of cultural resistance and cultural progress when it comes to sociology. Cultural progress is a concept central to all sociological theories, is the idea that cultures progress and cultures change. People's attitude changes based on experience. People's attitude changes based on trial and error, based on experimentation, based on all these things. And based on that, people's attitude progresses. People's attitude change. On the other hand, you could have cultural lag, where culture can take time to catch up to technological innovations. Maybe people in the old days, they preferred their typewriters. People have been using typewriters for 30 years and they wanted to stop using it. I mean, I remember when I used to, in the early days of computers, I used to use other word processing programs like Professional Write and WordPerfect and things like that. And then when everybody else in the world started to use Word, because Word became very popular and everybody else was using Word format documents, I still wanted to keep using my old programs, my old word processing programs, and of course I had adaptability problems and all sorts of issues that were unsupported. The issues that with the program were unsupported, but until I finally eventually gave up and moved over to Word. But the point is that Cultural lag is the idea people don't want to always be changing everything they do. They want to kind of be in a familiar world that they've been used to. So this can cause social problems where people, especially older people, kind of get stuck in the past, and younger people want to constantly change everything and don't give any respect to the previous way things were done. Cultural leveling is the idea that cultures, especially in today's day and age, become more and more similar to each other because of the fact that there's so much travel and so much communication, and the world is becoming a global community. The idea that whereas in the old days people in the United States and people in Africa may not have had much communication, and people in Europe, people in Asia, they just didn't really know it. Chinese and the Brits didn't really have anything to do with each other. Whereas today, if you wanted to go from the Orient, if you wanted to go from China to Britain in the 1700s, it was a boat, and it took a long time, and it was perilous. And you went on a trip, even if you had business there, you went on a trip there once a year. If you were, that was a lot. Whereas in today's day and age, of course, a trip from Britain to the Far East is an airplane ride. You get there in a few hours and then you're there. And in terms of communicating with people across the world, it's extremely easy to do. You don't even have to pay for a long distance phone call anymore. You can Skype, you can text, you can do pretty much anything. So the idea is that the cultures become more and more similar to each other because we all have access to we have access to the good things in their culture, and they have access to the good things in our culture, and sooner or later everything becomes one big mishmash. Now that doesn't mean that there's no difference between cultures today. Of course there still is, but it's not as pronounced as it once was. Then we have the idea of environmental injustice, also a sociological phenomenon, where people, in order to generate more profits, in order to generate more business, don't worry as much sometimes about harming other people in the world through things like pollution. Pollution is the presence of a substance or things that has harmful or poisonous effect on the environment. People who are most affected by pollution around the world are minority groups and the poor, very often people in countries that, we in the United States, if things are polluted, well, if our water is polluted, okay, we can go to the store and get bottled water, or we can have remediation plans to remediation strategies to clean up rivers. Well, in India or Bangladesh and places that don't have the kind of money, they might rely on tap water and rainwater to drink, and they might not have the ability to clean up so quickly. So pollution may not affect us as much because we have the wealth to overcome pollution or to not subject ourselves to pollution, whereas poorer people may not have that kind of an option. And companies that are run for profits, may not necessarily think of the good of the extremely poor people who are going to be impacted by pollution. Deforestation is another example. Cutting down forests, clearing away trees for use for paper and wood is causing the disappearance of a rainforest, which of course causes animals to become extinct, causes even some people to lose their environment. Of course, it could also cause enormous environmental programs when it comes to global warming and the greenhouse effect because of the decrease of oxygen in the air and various other, and therefore the increase in carbon dioxide in the air, and other harmful environmental factors. Sociology, really the ultimate sociology is this idea of geopolitics. Geopolitics is, it says over here the realigning of the world power since World War II. That's an element of geopolitics. Geopolitics in general just means the country in which the ways in which countries deal with each other, and which countries control the various markets of the world and things like that. So the geopolitical structure of today, since Japan-centered Asia, this may be a couple of decades old in terms of an idea today. Asia is really more centered on China than it is on Japan, but okay. Certainly Japan has a strong influence. Germany-centered Europe. Germany is probably the single most influential country in Europe right now, especially in the European Union. United States-centered Western Hemisphere. That's just the geopolitical fact as it just happens to be right now, although that, of course, could change. You've got the G8. The G8 are certainly 7 powerful countries, which the United States, Japan, Germany, Canada, France, Britain, and Italy, which are, developed Western countries. Russia was added, making the G8. China could make it to G9. And the point of this group is to perpetuate, well, I don't know about perpetuate industrial dominance, but the point is to establish the rules and regulations under which the global markets are going to be run, and to try to settle any economic conflicts that happen in terms of imports, exports, things like that. Okay, I think that's pretty much all for I had right now. So good luck with the course, and thank you for listening, and have a great day.